Thanks for that. Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Cross, Curator of Visual Arts here at MoCA, and I'm thrilled to have Carrie Schneider and Laura Mulvey, ta-da, magic, joining us from the UK, and Sarah Lukowski. They're here to discuss Carrie's powerful exhibition, Sphinx, which I hope all of you have seen, the influence of Laura Mulvey's work, and the many questions that both provoke about the contemporary image making, cinematic images of women in particular, changing modes of spectatorship, and so much more. Let me briefly introduce each of these brilliant speakers. First, photographer and filmmaker Carrie Schneider. Her work has been presented nationally and internationally at venues including the California Museum of Photography at Riverside, our neighbors, the University of Albany, Brown University, Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, Perez Art Museum, Haggerty Museum of Marquette University, and so many more, just a little taste. Her work is also in the permanent collections of the Art Institute of Chicago, the Tang Teaching Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Photography, Chicago, the Minneapolis Institute of Art, DePaul University in Chicago, and again, many more. She's received awards and grants from the likes of Creative Capital, the Jerome Foundation, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, and the Fulbright Program, and she's participated in residency programs such as YADU and the Atlantic Center for the Arts. Next, I'm so honored. Oh, where'd she go?
Laura, come back.
She is gonna stay.
I'm back.
She already knows about herself. Okay, actually I should stand so Laura can see me. So next, I'm so honored and thrilled to have Laura Mulvey with us. Laura, thank you for joining us at a late hour for you. Laura Mulvey hardly needs an introduction. Her work as a writer and filmmaker has been deeply influential for both film and feminist studies, bringing together film theory, psychoanalysis, and feminism. She's particularly well known for her seminal essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, published in 1975 in the British journal Screen. And since then, her insights and influence have continued for 5 decades in her many books, including Visual and Other Pleasures, Citizen Kane, Fetishism and Curiosity, Death 24 by a Second, Stillness and Moving Image, and her newest book, Afterimages on Cinema, Women, and Changing Times. She's been a professor of film and media studies at the University of London and director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Moving Image. In addition, Mulvey has made 6 films in collaboration with Peter Wolin, including Riddles of the Sphinx from 1977, which Carrie's exhibition references. Then Sarah, who joins us all the way from Norway. Sarah Lukowski was a contributor to the Sphinx exhibition catalog with a wonderful essay titled, I love this, Vixens, Sphinxes, Mommies, and Some Sphincters Too. She is a curator, writer, and art historian with a background in film and media and theory and criticism, and is currently the director of Art House in Oslo. Previously, she served as Dean of the Academy of Fine Arts at the Oslo National Academy of Fine Art, as head of curatorial studies at the Whitney Museum's Independent Study Program, associate director of MoMA's International Program, and she was the general advisor to the 9th Berlin Biennial, and as a regular contributor to many books and periodicals, including Art Forum and Dis Magazine, where she was the editor. So we've got a lot of brain power up here. So before I hand over the mic, I wanted to give you an outline of tonight's event. First, Carrie will walk us through her work and many of the influences that shaped it with the help of a slide presentation, so Laura's lovely face will disappear for a while. Then Laura will return and discuss her research and intersections with many of the themes in Carrie's work. Then Sarah will offer us her own thoughts and insights and moderate a conversation, and eventually opening up the questions to the audience. So I also want to just give a plug for the beautiful book that we published, and after the event, if you want to stick around for a few minutes down in our new bookstore, R&D, if you want to buy a book, Carrie and Sarah will be there to sign them. So enjoy tonight. Thank you again, Laura. Thank you all so much, and I'll hand it over to Carrie Schneider.
Thank you, Susan, for the kind introduction. And I just want to say thank you for making Sphinx possible, Susan. You are an artist's dream, and I'm really lucky you and I crossed paths. And I just want to say also, we're in the final days of my exhibition, and I want to say thank you to everyone at MoCA for hosting me these last 6 months. There's such a kind of brain trust here. I feel really lucky to have worked with you all, so thanks for having me. And also to Sarah and Laura, thanks for being my thinking partners in this for like the last entire year. I feel so much gratitude to you both, and thank you to everyone in the audience for being here. I really look forward to turning the mic over to you at the end of this. I'm trying to cram about 3 hours worth of content into about 15-20 minutes, and also showing some media. So I might miss a few things or skim over something. If there's anything that you're really missing, please address it in the Q&A or after. I'm really going to focus today on the work in the exhibition, the most recent work, Sphinx, and also its relationship to Laura Mulvey's work and her thinking, and how she's been a touchstone to my process. But first I'm just going to quickly touch on the process that I used to make all of this work. Next. I made everything in the exhibition using this camera in my studio. I made it in the pandemic with industrial materials, and it's large enough for me to stand inside. Next. I use this pretty idiosyncratic process where I expose chromogenic paper through the lens of this giant camera, and the effect is that it renders the image into a negative. And if I choose to process that negative paper negative again, it turns it back into a positive. So this kind of illustrates it here. Sometimes I display them side by side. Here's two deep-like works in the earliest work. This process requires complete darkness and delayed gratification, like any analog process. Next. So I cut the paper from very long photographic rolls, 20 inches wide by 275 feet long, and so it results in these irregular shapes, and I worked really intuitively. The imagery, I was working, this is all pandemic driven. I was sourcing my phone, art historical references, my own archive, and just random stuff floating around my studio. Next, the deep-like photographs, there's 105 images in this series, and the process, I think it's autobiographical in a way that I think is best described via affect theorist Lauren Berlantz saying that any attempted autobiography is anxious and ambivalent, and I identify with that. Next. I modified my camera, the next step was modifying my camera to scale up to larger paper, and what it offered me was kind of discovering new color families and more abstraction and accident, and I was able to further exhaust motifs. Next. This is just a shot of my studio in Hudson showing that the photographic media comes in these giant rolls. Next. There was a point where I realized I could stop cutting the paper, and so what I did is I started just pulling down the media maybe 10, 20, 40 inches at a time and exposing an image again and again, and just made a simple uptake roll, kind of like in the back of a 35 millimeter analog camera. There's a feeding spool and an uptake spool. And this is my first attempt. It's over 9 feet long. Next. Play. And this is just showing me exposing an entire roll of 164 feet of photographic paper. This is part of Eve of the Future, one of the photo sculptures in the exhibition. This footage is sped up here. It takes about 45 minutes to run through a processor, something that took me about 3 weeks to expose. Next. Just to show the scale of the work. This is Gerard Francoya from my own color lab in New York City. Next. So installing the sculptural works was really mind-bending to me. I had not made sculpture prior to this. And it was, one thing that I really noted early on was that there's no gestalt, there's no fixed gaze, and that was something that really threw me at first, but what it reminded me of really remarkably was more time-based work, how I was literally gathering footage. It's footage. And so all I had to do was next sit with the medium and wait for it to speak to me. And then eventually it would tell me what it wanted to be next. So conceptually, I'm just going to go through some, in installing these sculptural works, I had hoped to evoke spilled guts, kind of like the horror panic of the irreversibility of like a disemboweled torso or something gross like that, or like an analog camera unspooling, or your search history made public. So next, I wanted to retain the material qualities of the media, so when it's spilled, it kind of retains the shape of the original spool somewhat, like these organic curls, and it's like almost like it's mocking you, and I wanted to retain that in the sculptures. Next, I was interested in the history of scrolls in feminist art history, suggesting language, the body, interiority made external. Next, I was thinking about dematerialization in the history of American conceptual art and post-minimalism, thinking about material investigations of industrial materials ending up looking something like this. Next. Another major touchstone for me is the work of Andy Warhol. In the 60s, he made 472 films called screen tests. And in the early 2000s, as a young person, I worked at the Andy Warhol Museum, and it was during a time where they were remastering all of these beautiful films, each one shot on 100 feet of black and white, 16 millimeter film. They were remastering the films, and I got to, on my lunch break, sit and just watch them in a darkened theater like this. And it was like beyond immersion for me. I remember just being so affected by them, especially the sitters that I didn't know, that I just felt this kind of out-of-body experience where I felt, my breath slowed, time kind of stopped. And I often think of this work as really illustrating the theory of Deleuze in his writing Cinema One, talking about the affect image, that the close-up of the face in cinema is what we then see are these micro-expressions, that these micro-movements render every blink, every little micro-movement a narrative climax. Next. That's just quoting that. Next. So there have been hundreds of studies of something that we can already intuit, that the human face is magnetic like nothing else. As an undergraduate, I studied cognitive psychology. That was my second major. Next. Next, I think I accidentally cut something. This is my child, my human child, the day he was born, eventually tracking my face. I just kind of wanted to note the influence of parenthood on my work in life that kind of intensifies my own relationship to time, and the Lacanian chronology that the mother is always the before. Next. I also, just stay with me here. So this David Foster Wallace, there's this 1,000-page book that I think sums up something about American white male subjectivity under late racial capitalism. This book was written in 1996, and there's a subplot in the book that there's a lethally addictive film that is sent in the mail kind of like a terrorist plot, the way anthrax is sent through the mail, so that the unsuspecting recipient will open up the package, pop in the film cartridge, and start playing the film, and they won't be able to look away, or they can't, or they decide not to look away, so much so that they forget to eat, drink, they shit themselves, they die, just watching this film because it's so addictive. And the subject of the film, it's a blurry face of a woman. It's shot with something that David Foster Wallace calls a neonatal lens. The woman is just sitting there leaning forward as if she's looking into a bassinet. 2 quotes from the book. "Death is always female, and the female is maternal. The woman who kills you will be your next life's mother. The misogyny is pretty ripe, but maybe it will make more sense soon. Next. Next. So next I'm talking about dear Laura Mulvey. Next. This is a still from her 1977 film, Riddles of the Sphinx. I first saw this about a decade ago when I was a student at the Whitney Independent Study Program in New York, and it left a real mark on me materially, conceptually, personally, politically. My viewing of it was, I think, very much informed in no small part by her 1975 essay, Visual Pleasures in Narrative Cinema. Laura had spoken about visual pleasures as being an artist's experiment, as being very visual, as being a totally non-academic exercise, but in writing it, she really laid the tracks for thinking about the complex dynamics of gender and power and the politics of representation for decades to come. So 2 years after Laura made this film, 2 years after Laura wrote Visual Pleasures, she made this film with Peter Woolen. I'm going to play 2 short clips, the first of which I'm going to talk over just for a little bit for sake of time, and then I'll immediately play the next clip. Next. So Riddles of the Sphinx is structuralist in nature. Laura has said that the action in front of the camera determined the length of the shot. So this is also a material investigation. She reshot found footage using an unconventional stop motion camera that's normally used for surveillance and sports footage analysis. And the effect is zooming in on the image, further abstracting it, and emphasizing its materiality, something I really relate to in my work. Also for Laura, and we can talk about this more, the Sphinx is pre-Oedipal. Oedipus brings in the patriarchy with him. Oh, shoot.
Should be here by now. A little boy with fair hair.
I think he's going to come across the footbridge.
What were you asking about your little girl? Oh, well, at the moment she's in a community nursery where Maxine works. But I was wondering whether it wouldn't be better to have a nursery at work. Have the unions thought about that? Not much, really. You're lucky to get any sort of daycare, let alone getting one that suits you best.
Hello. Give us to your mother and say thanks for waiting. Right, bye.
The whole country, yeah.
Local authorities are cutting back nursery education anyway.
Yes, that's right. It may stimulate the women to demand more for themselves, though. Have the unions ever done anything at all about daycare? They haven't done very much. The TUC is in favour of free state nursery care for any parent who wants it, but we're a long way from that. I was wondering whether there are some nurseries in the textile industry, and the unions do negotiate about childcare there, but that's an industry that really depends on women's labour. Unless there's organised action around it, the union wouldn't have any reason to take it up. It's like most things.
We have to do something first if we want the union to keep it up.
How can you make people see the connection between better wages and providing daycare?
Well, trades unionism isn't just a question of wages struggles. It's about work conditions too, it has to be. In that case, might the unions get involved in running nurseries? They might. All sorts of questions come up with workplace nurseries. Should the mothers be allowed to visit during the day? Should the creche stay open to let women shop before they collect their children? Some unions want the employers to pay for company nurseries, but to have the nurseries run by unions and parents together.
So Riddles of the Sphinx loosely retells the Oedipal myth from the perspective of a single mother navigating the world. You hear her discussing childcare and labor unions. The ethos guiding this work also guided Laura's writing over decades, as seen throughout Visual and Other Pleasures, Death 24 Times a Second, and Afterimages. I have all of them here. And then even though her ideas shift over time to formal qualities common in both avant-garde and mainstream cinema, to acknowledging white feminism's blind spots in early Hollywood's racism, to embracing new technologies and analyzing their impacts on spectatorship. What is common to Laura's writing is her insistence that the language of images demands theorization. What's specifically important to me and to my current body of work is Laura's theorization of the feminine face in cinema as being the ultimate spectacle, in that it stops narrative flow, which equals stillness, which suggests the literal celluloid film strip, which equals death, which equals the end of utopia. So stay with us here. So what's next? Yeah, so here are my notes from Laura Mulvey's Whitney Independent Study Program visit back in 2016 in March. I took dozens of pages of notes. This is when I first met her. And it's all here. I don't know if you all can see it. Yeah, you probably can. Structuralism in film, Oedipal tragedy, women who kill, hostility to selfhood, cinema in and of everyday life. So I had applied to the program in part to work with Laura Mulvey, and in my actual application I'd asked, are conversations begun by feminists in the 1970s newly relevant to my generation? And I think this is a question I'm still trying to answer. You know, and maybe looking to the 1970s in imagery and in theory, perhaps I'm trying to locate this utopia that Laura speaks about, the maternal before time, when there was a sense of promise. I'm not sure. Laura speaks of the medical questions of the 1970s feminism, that in the 70s, folks were literally fighting for autonomy of the body and reproductive rights, leading to questions. Those questions led to questions regarding representation of the body, so one had to come before the other. And it occurred to me in preparing for this talk and reading daily headlines that because the medical is under constant urgent threat in this country and elsewhere in the world, for example, Roe's overturn or what was happening in Poland even today, it would make sense that we would once again find representation of the body as a ripe political site worthy of theorization at the very minimum. Which leads me to Romy Schneider. We will play a short clip. It's about 2 minutes and 45 seconds from the 1975 film, The Most Important Thing, Love. Play.
Alors la caméra passe de l'autre côté. C'est là. Bon, alors maintenant tu le prends. Doucement. Doucement. Tu le tires. Là. Là. Tu le pousses devant la caméra. Là-bas. Toi devant. Là. Bon, c'est bon. Alors maintenant, tu lui mets la tête là. Ça, c'est très important. Il est presque mort, mais c'est la vie. Alors, tu vas le prendre. Tu lui prends la tête, tu vas lui dire mais je t'aime. Après, tu vas, maintenant, on va répéter juste ton gros plan. Alors, après, tu vas le baiser, tu vas le prendre. Voilà, voilà. Là, on appelle. Et garde le pantalon. Quand tu vas tourner journée, il n'y aura plus de pantalon. Ce sera beaucoup plus facile. Va lui dire que tu lèves. Vas-y, allez, vas-y, dis-lui. Allez, dis-lui que tu lèves. Vas-y. Allez, vas-y. Vas-y. Allez, dis-le.
On se tait. Silence.
Allez, dis-le. Dis-le. Je t'aime. Encore. Je t'aime. Encore. Je t'aime. Sens-le bien sur toi. Sens-le. Tu vas commencer à t'exciter par lui. En même temps, tu vas lui dire je t'aime. Allez, essaye. Vas-y, sens-le. Tu lui dis je t'aime. Encore.
Je t'aime.
Encore. Non, ça va pas.
Mais je ne peux pas.
Mais si, tu peux.
Non, je ne peux pas faire ça. Mais c'est trop.
Allez. T'as un contrat, t'es payé pour
Mais
ça.
je peux pas.
Tu fais ce qu'on demande. Allez. Mets pas de commentaires. Allez, vas-y. Voilà. Sens-le bien. Sens-le. Bien. Mais c'est de la vie que tu l'aimes. Allez, vas-y. Encore. Bien. Encore. Allez. Tu l'aimes. Allez.
Je t'aime.
Encore. Vas-y.
Faites pas de photos, s'il vous plaît. Non, je suis une comédienne, vous savez, je sais faire des trucs bien. Ça ici, je le fais pour bouffer. C'est tout, alors ne faites pas de photos.
C'est celui-là.
S'il vous plaît.
On part du plateau.
Et vous, là.
Next. If you've seen the show over there, I source Romy Schneider's face 1,000 times at least in I should count. But the context, I think, of the clip that I sourced, the 8 seconds, 316 frames, the context is important that there's this multi-dimensional aspect to her representation. She's being filmed, and is begging not to be photographed. I think it's also important to note that she is working. You know, she's a softcore actress, and she is just doing her job. Next. So 2 years ago, I did not know who Romy Schneider was. My German friend showed me on her phone and couldn't believe it because we do share this surname, which is also part of my attraction to working with her. But I quickly learned that she's an icon in European cinema. When I first saw this clip on her phone, this is her hand holding the phone. When I saw it on YouTube, my first thought was, this is a lost screen test. Next. Which brings me to Sphinx. The answer isn't man, installed upstairs. It's comprised of 316 still frames from the film we just saw, each still frame held up by my phone with my hand, exposing each still frame through my camera's lens onto chromogenic paper, and then I reanimated it onto 16 millimeter film at 16 frames a second, just like Warhol's screen tests. I thought there was this kind of perfect Deleuzian affect image. Next. That there was this range of micro-expressions from fear to disgust, sadness, desire, betrayal, disbelief, contempt, recognition, and resignation. Next. Each individual frame from Sphinx was rephotographed from the length of this sculpture called Madame Psychosis, Joël Van Dyne, an 800 feet long photograph that's installed in the gallery in the shape of a sphinx. Next. The significance of the title, Madame Psychosis, Joël Van Dyne, is that's the name of the woman in David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest, the name of the actress who plays the person whose face is looking into the bassinet in the lethally addictive film. Next. And next, just play the clip. Okay, and now Laura Mulvey.
Hello, everybody. I'm talking from London, and it's much later here than it is over there in Massachusetts. But I'd like to begin by saying how very, very delighted I am to be here, to be in discussion with Carrie Schneider, Sarah Lubkowski, and to talk about Carrie's extraordinary work, Sphinx. The answer is not man. I would very much have liked to have been with you in person, and I'd hoped to be at MoCA in March. But seeing that that wasn't possible, I'd now like to say how grateful I am to Susan Cross for organizing this hybrid event so I can participate in some way or another. Now, because I'm on Zoom, I've just prepared a short paper to read. It seemed easier to control, and I don't have the audience rapport in a way that I might have enjoyed if I was with you there and able to be a little bit more flexible. But my presentation is in 3 parts. First of all, I'm discussing a kind of dialogue between some of my thoughts in the book, Death 24 Times a Second, Stillness and the Moving Image, published in 2006, that's been mentioned a couple of times. And the dialogue between that and Carrie's Sphinx. Then, secondly, I want to make some comments on the sequence that we've just seen of L'Importance d'Aimer, which was directed by Andrei Zulawski in 1975, from which Carrie's 316 frames are taken and become the substance of the work that we're discussing this evening. And finally, as point number 3, I want to think about some further implications focused on Carrie's use of media and the temporalities that are implied by her intermediality and how the work relates to certain kind of discussions in contemporary film theory. Now, the key idea in Death 24, the one that overlaps to my mind crucially with Sphinx, and with which I'm so pleased to find an affinity, is that of what I called in the book delayed cinema. The spectator, I suggest in the book that the spectator's very simple but novel ability to intervene with the flow of film, the flow of the moving image, to repeat an image, to stop, to repeat, to slow down the image, especially if the spectator is imposing this new technology on an old celluloid film. And that is to delay the cinema, and I'm particularly interested in that interaction between the old and the new. Now, there's another kind of delayed cinema, which I don't talk about very much in my book, but has come to me as a more interesting issue since then. Sometimes a significant cinematic detail or moment that can't really be seen, picked up on at 24 frames a second, has lain dormant, dormant, and then by pausing the moving image, it can be uncovered and rediscovered. To my mind, there's a kind of wonder involved when, after a considerable lapse in time, such a detail comes into visibility. And I feel that Carrie's discovery of a particular film image of Romy Schneider, stretched across a distance of nearly 50 years, and then her transformation of this poignant moment for a feminist aesthetic analysis, partakes of both aspects of delay. That is, the methodology of the pause and also the discovery of lost details, or indeed what I like to call it, the deferred enigma. I suggested in Death 24 Times a Second that the spectator of delayed cinema oscillates between the possessive, a fascinated spectator who pauses the moving image in order to hold a precious figure, a gesture, a moment, etc. And on the other hand, a pensive spectator who can often be a mutation, in fact, of the possessive. But this is a spectator who, I imagined, pauses the moving image to think about it, to reflect, for instance, on cinematic time, or, for instance, how film conjures up meaning out of its own material specificity. If Carrie was, in the first instance, fascinated by Romy Schneider's image, perhaps as a possessive spectator, she also understood that this image, indeed fascinating, has a wider, complex, and political resonance, and she embarked on a pensive analysis, demonstrating, analyzing, hoping to understand, trying to pin down the image's meaning and significance, and, I need to emphasize, from a feminist perspective. Carrie extracted 316 frames from the original sequence, the one that we just saw, to create Sphinx, the answer is not man. I would like to trace a few aspects of the sequence, the combination of dramatic circumstances that led up to this poignant close-up of Romy Schneider's face, the hidden detail that she, Carrie, has brought to light. Just to elaborate, as Carrie has shown us, in the original scene, a film is being made, and Romy Schneider plays Nadine, who's an actress. The diegetic camera tracks forward into a close-up on the rehearsal scene, the one that we're seeing, and Nadine balks at saying the words, "Je t'aime, I love you." In deep distress, she brings the filming to a halt, saying, "Je ne peux pas, I can't, I can't." Quite suddenly, the film's tone changes. In that already overcharged moment, Nadine notices a man surreptitiously photographing her with a still camera. At that moment, music floods onto the soundtrack, melodramatically, I may say, and Nadine begs him to desist. 3 shots of Nadine in close-up, intercut with the young man's fixed gaze at her as his camera clicks, creates a vignette literally revolving around the imposition of male voyeurism on the woman as object of the gaze. But Nadine resists. She reaches out her hand to block the photograph, and incidentally and quite interestingly, she also throws the film camera out of focus at the same time. Now, Carrie's series of images concentrate on the conflicted emotions etched on Romy's face, and Carrie, in her presentation just now, just gave us a very beautiful and eloquent listing of how she felt them. So, Romy's face as she reacts to this situation. So Carrie first transformed 316 frames into a series of long photographs, stills that were then animated into the film element of Sphinx. Here I see Carrie as both possessive and pensive spectator, exploring her fascination with this image and her desire to understand it. From a feminist perspective, she focuses on the representational politics inscribed in the scene, and she mentioned herself the way in which I, in the past, have discussed how the politics of the female body led on to a politics of the representation of the female body, making representation actually a political issue, I believe, for the first time ever. But anyway, to get back, Nadine's pleading look, the reality of her emotion, the artificiality of her features, exaggerated by cosmetics and false eyelashes, seemingly crumbling under the dominant male gaze, intensified by the photographic machine. Anyone who is familiar with my 1975 visual pleasure narrative cinema essay will have recognized that I'm reading Carrie's images through that lens, as it were. There are reasons why the director of L'Important, Zulawski, might have constructed this vignette that relate to the film's later narrative, which I don't think we need to go into. The narrative rationale is not that relevant. Carrie perceived in a scene of male voyeurism and female vulnerability an outstanding and poetically charged star image. The tawdry, exploitative glamour, combined with Romy's extreme beauty, condense, speak to the long exploitative history of female stars across many and any film industry. At the same time, Romy Schneider's performance conveys an intense feeling, a pathos, to which any spectator would respond with empathy. This brilliant performance evokes a parallel history, one in which some female stars, remorselessly sexualized, struggled against odds to be what was called taken seriously. We could think of many. Marilyn Monroe, for instance, inevitably comes to mind. Furthermore, Romy Schneider's pathos and her words, "no photos," whether consciously intended in the film or not, seem, as she looks directly out through the camera at the spectators, to plead for an end to all this. To return to my earlier point, this is where in Sphinx, the latent, deferred meaning, the deferred enigma, is finding visibility. So just to recap, the image of Romy Schneider, I'll say that again. To recap, the image of Romy Schneider, already powerfully overdetermined in its original setting, has lain dormant for nearly 50 years for its feminist significance to be taken seriously by Carrie Schneider and turned into the central proposition of this exhibition. If I argued for delayed cinema in the first instance in terms of spectatorship, on the other hand, the process of slowing down the moving image, reproducing its stillness, and so on, has been essential to Carrie's method, her development of the project as an artist. The long photographs are made up of the individual frames that Carrie selected, and she's just shown us very eloquently how she worked on them and how they've been displayed in the gallery. And these individual frames refer in different ways back to celluloid. Uncannily, the long stretches of photographic paper with Romy's close-up minutely shifting across time are reminiscent in a gigantic and almost unrecognizable form of the individual still frames of the celluloid film strip, while the materials making up the amazing sculptures refer to the fall and fold of celluloid, escapes, if it ever does, from the safety of its reel. For me, the presence of the phone and the appearance of the 16mm film in juxtaposition is of the essence. Not only, as she explained, did Carrie first discover Rumi on YouTube, but she used her phone for the refilming process that transferred it to quite a different medium, the 16mm, the film projected in the gallery. And although the original film, and throughout the original film, as seen in the cinemas in 1975, is a haunting presence, as it were, a distant primal scene. Carrie's Sphinx has, to my mind, an important place in contemporary discussions of intermediality and its relation to media temporalities. And so I'd like to end with a couple of points on this topic. In the first instance, Sphinx is a work that revolves around quotation, the appropriation of an image which is then located in quite a different context, relocated in quite a different context. Here, immediately, there's a montage, as it were, between the then of the original and the now of its citation. As in Sphinx, the earlier time haunts the later work, collapsing decades, acquiring quite another meaning in quite another century. And Carrie's rephotography can be compared, as she has done, to Peter's and my rephotography in Riddles, which was itself a citation of Ken Jacobs's rephotography in his film Tom, Tom the Piper's Son. Each case involves appropriation and remediation in which the time of one work is juxtaposed to, amalgamated into the other. Carrie's use of her phone gives the work a very distinct intermedial relevance, the kind of remediation across technologies this kind of remediation across technologies challenges a traditional concept of history and media history as linear and teleological, and most particularly places the traditional understanding of the old and the new in a much more complex perspective. Work such as Carrie's resists the notion that a new technology creates an inevitable break with the past, and suggests, on the contrary, that new configurations of what is understood as past and present can create a new kind of juncture between the two. Time, that is confused. In the dialogue between old and new media, new intermedial configuration is formed. As, for instance, old films, as I said at the beginning, can be seen digitally with new eyes. Rather than relegating film to a bygone era, digital technology brings to the old new life and new complexities. To end, these kinds of intermedial appropriations themselves have an effect on our understanding of time. As a final note, at a moment when new technologies seem to hurry life headlong into the future, to pause the moving image allows thought about time itself and how it might be understood within the wider, contested patterns of politics and history. That's all.
Thank you so much, Laura, for your thoughtful contribution. I can hear that Carrie is thankful. I just want to remind you of the kind of sequence of events here. So I am going to be moderating a conversation dialogue between Carrie and Laura, but I was asked also to give a little preamble, which I have written to, I think, give a little context to how I know both Carrie and Laura, and also kind of how I see them in relationship. But then remember that we're going to have questions also from the audience. So as you kind of hear us talk, think about what you would like to ask. We'll leave time for that. So 1975
is a year of importance for this conversation. L'importance c'est d'aimer, the film upon which Carrie has based many works in the exhibition, was completed in that year, as was Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, Laura's seminal essay that wove together cinematic viewing and psychoanalysis through a feminist lens. Now, Carrie was born in 1979, and I was born in 1978. So 1975 is us respectively 3 to 4 years before the date of our emergence, in case you didn't know math. I do. Carrie and I were born into a world saturated with images of women, where celluloid still dominated. And psychoanalysis had had a strong impact on the generation of our teachers, I think especially the younger ones. For instance, I remember in the 8th grade, and this is probably because I grew up in Denmark, our Danish teacher gave us an assignment, a class assignment, in which we had to look through print advertisements at home in search of the phallus. And you will not be surprised to know that these budding teenagers found them everywhere. And later, much later, I was at the Whitney Independent Study Program for 6 years. Carrie went through the program a different year, so we never met there, but when we did later cross paths, it was definitely as a result of its orbits. And Laura, along with other seminal thinkers and makers like Martha Rosler, Yvonne Rainer, and Mary Kelly, would pass through the Whitney ISP every year. They were meetings, thus, in a way, between generations, but with many commonalities that I would say were unfixed from decades. Mary Kelly, one of these speakers and artists, feminist artists, has spoken about what she calls the political primal scene, which I have found to be a useful concept. In Freud, the primal scene is the sexual act that informs the child's question, where do I come from? In other words, the search for an originary moment that cannot possibly be seen and which is shrouded in the unspoken and the forbidden. By adding the word political to the primal scene, political primal scene, Mary Kelly brings together the familial with the grand narratives of social and political change. Digging into Carrie's work, as I have now, I have been thinking about 1975 as a political primal scene for Carrie and me. It's a moment of great cultural and theoretical shifts, tangled up with the revolutionary aspirations to fundamentally transform everyday life through the intersecting struggles of civil rights, feminism, and anti-colonial movements. Both of us, I know, have been intellectually and politically preoccupied with the utopian thrusts of that moment. I would hazard to say then that L'importance c'est d'aimer and the film Carrie, which is also cited in this show, though we haven't seen it tonight, is part of our cinematic primal scene. Films like these, with women captured on screen as weeping divas at a moment of second-generation feminist fervor, produced us, it preceded us. They structured the world we were born into, but which we were never privy to with our own eyes. I think in a way we both felt through cultural productions, texts, and teachers that we lived it. But our only relationship to it can be one of projection. It's a moment that, as Laura has written, holds histories that we cannot yet afford to abandon. Now, Laura came to film in the cinema, on celluloid, a space in which one sat and saw alongside many. She has since, as we heard today, grappled with how that experience has changed as digital technologies have taken the stage. Carrie and I, meanwhile, have been formed during the transitions to VHS and digital as screens became smaller and intimately infiltrated every moment of the day. Media has become fragmented, algorithmically determined, and our screens now share our information to corporations more than they provide in return. In Carrie's work, our cinematic primal scene is tapped, fingered, stolen from a bootleg source, and called up in contexts with which it is completely at odds. The last cinematic divas, I think one could say that Romy is part of, tumble out onto the floor. Their material sources cut, curled, bunched up, and put together again, wound up again, and watched on 16 mil. They seep into the present through the fragmented, distracted, glowing technologies of this time. They sit uneasily within the legacies of feminism, and their role for the present is similarly unsettled. Despite different reworkings, the female cinematic face in the work of Carrie and Laura comes to loom large once again, having otherwise faded from cultural prevalence. As we see her, she watches over us, looks back from a different time, seeing things we could not possibly see. And with that little preamble, we're gonna chat a little bit.
Thanks, Sarah. That's lovely.
I thought maybe, I don't know if folks recall the poster for this evening. It's an image of Romy Schneider, reworked by Carrie, as well as the cover of Laura Mulvey's book Afterimage. And I just thought maybe we would, thank you for bringing it up there. I remember when we spoke, Carrie, you told a little anecdote about having come across this, and I thought it was a nice way to begin, possibly.
Absolutely. I think, and this was one detail that I neglected to mention in my presentation, is that there were all of these other references, non-Mulvey references, that were kind of top of mind as I was starting to make this work. And I had a studio visit with Sarah, and she suggested, hey, have you read Laura recently? And I was like, recently? Well, let me look at it again. And I cracked open my books that are, I've read many times and referenced, and have dog ears and marginalia. And I was reading it, and I was so shocked that I felt like I was illustrating her theory, which is not something that I would ever recommend to anyone to actually do as an artist. But it was kind of, it was uncanny in this way. And I reached out to Laura, and she said, by God, Carrie, let me send you, do you have my most recent book? And I had not yet read it, and she sent me the PDF of it. I now have the hard copy. But to see that this was on the cover, and kind of seeing all of the work that I was making in inverting an image, and then it was just uncanny. I was like, okay, we're onto something here, and that we're talking about some of the same things. But
yeah, that's a good.
So thanks to you, we're talking today. Yes, and thanks to Laura.
I think.
Oh, but yeah. There's one other thing I wanted to say. So in rereading these texts, it just reminded me that Laura's work was completely the armature upon which all of the other things hung. That was kind of what formed me. So in thinking of this primal scene, that it was something that was so present that it was almost something that I didn't recognize.
Oh, Carrie, I'm a little bit overcome, actually. Not quite sure how I could enter into this conversation, but I do really, really appreciate what you're saying. And also, you do have to realize that it works vice versa as well. I can recognize in your work things that I've been thinking about, and that there are kind of parallel histories there, as well as primal scenes.
While we were, while I was just a little comment, because I was thinking also of the 16 millimeter work, how in a way it's a work that could never have been without visual pleasure, narrative cinema, like that, the kind of spectatorship being, the very jittery, manicured fingernails, I think, are, they're a little kind of ode to Laura Mulvey right there. So I just kind of struck me.
But if I can interrupt for a second, I didn't really say as much as I wanted to about 16 millimeter in my paper, because of course 16 millimeter is really so identified with 1970s experimental film. Yes. And so the fact that you've gone back to 16 millimeter is in itself, as it were, another confusion of time. Yes. And it's a real return to that, what Mary calls the political primal scene. But that is also, in a sense, the cinematic primal scene for all our avant-garde and experimental work. So it's really very moving to me to see the 16mm footage, and indeed to hear the clattering of the poor projector as it sits in the room, as it always used to in the old days of 16mm screenings.
Yes, I believe you've called this the warmth of the mechanism, which is, I think, now in the age of digital technologies, that having this, the analog machine actually feels so cozy. I think there was a time where that felt like alienating, that there was something produced by that. But I think we were going to talk about how, 16mm, I think there was this real hope in the 70s that was something that was going to launch avant-garde cinema. It was, it was accessible. It was basically kind of a consumer level almost, that you were able to make films more cheaply, and you were mobile rather than working in 35mm cinema, for example. I think that's what you're referencing, and you've written on this extensively. But that moment also died. But I don't know the whole trajectory of that. But I do know, just in being a teacher and with my own students, that there is this really renewed interest in analog material, and I have my own ideas as for why I'm working in analog and why specifically I wanted to move this image back into analog media, from wresting it from the digital. But I know I'm teaching young students, my students that are 19 years old all want to be in the darkroom, and I wonder, there's some students here in the audience, if there's some interest as well as getting your hands in the chemistry. They're all nodding their heads. Yeah.
We in our little kind of pre-check with what we're check-in about what we're going to be talking about, Laura, you had brought up that this is really also a pandemic project, and that there are maybe some temporal aspects there. I mean, I think also just the little clip from Sphinx that touches on women's work in childcare, I think is something that was at play there, given what we were all facing as parents during that moment, working well with children, but it also gave a different relationship to media. I think both of us were transfixed to our phones reading the news, but also just kind of out of, I don't know. Do you want to talk just a little bit about that? And then maybe Laura has comments.
Can I just interrupt before Carrie? Because one of the things that I'd wanted to emphasize was how very, very, Carrie mentioned this in her presentation, but she didn't, I don't think, dwell on how very laborious the process was, how very work-intensive it was, and that perhaps there was something about the moment of lockdown, which meant that work could be extended, time could be stretched out. There seemed to be no point in working to an immediate deadline. Carrie, what would you say about that?
I have a lot of disparate thoughts about that. I think in the pandemic, I ended up teaching a graduate course called Art in the Age of Global Pandemic that I taught online for Pratt twice, actually, over 2 semesters, because we were locked down for so long. And so I thought about a lot of art that was being made during pandemics, the way that King Lear was famously written while Shakespeare was in quarantine, and the way that like David Wojnarowicz and his contemporaries, they were obviously thought of themselves as living through a pandemic in the height of the AIDS crisis, and especially in this country. But I think in terms of time, and specifically being in lockdown in this pandemic, I wouldn't want to return there. I think there was this kind of like excitement that I heard, which I couldn't relate to, that was supposedly this like the answer to the artist's prayer, that it was like an artist residency, and I couldn't have my experience of it couldn't have been further from the truth. And so I think there was this kind of extension of time, but also this incredible compression of it that I felt simultaneously really immersed in it, but totally alienated. And I think it was what I produced was a production of that kind of intense isolation and kind of a searching for meaning. But I think it was really driven. I think what it did drive was, kind of looking out to the outside world through this portal of my phone. And it's a little bit cynical, and that I was kind of trying to take that thing out of the digital and make it physical, make it something that I could hold, like possess it, like be this possessive spectator, but kind of actually make an object out of this personal inventory of things that were meaningful to me, whether it was my affective ties, friendships, the kind of figures in the history of art that inspired me, that I was kind of making this archive. Maybe, it was sort of an end of days gesture. I called it like a seed library impulse where, in case, I was reading Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower at the time, that there was this kind of impulse of saving for when all the other technologies failed. So I think it did grow out of something quite dark, and I'm happy we're beyond it. But I think it's very specific to that moment, the earliest work, especially.
I want to be sure to leave enough time for the audience, but maybe just one more question, which is, we've learned that the three of us can talk for hours. So, but I want to somehow touch on this idea or death, which is so central, Laura, to your writing on cinema, particularly as it relates to the female face in cinema. Then, of course, Carrie brings David Foster Wallace and all these other things to it. But maybe, Laura, you could speak a little bit about death and perhaps how you think of it in relationship to all of your work. I know it's too much to cite right now, but something that pertains to Carrie's work.
Yeah, I think as I think Carrie actually summed it up very astutely in her presentation when she made those connections between the presence of the film strip, the individual frame in the film strip, as being a still image, which is then animated to give the illusion of movement. So, and how that relates, metonymically, as it were, to the still photograph itself. And as any of us who've read Roland Barthes' Camera Lucida know, how he very elegantly ties the still photograph to a confusion of time and also to the presence of death. But I also think that we could move into the question of the celluloid mechanism, and remember, it does still happen, of course, how the animation of those still frames, the animation of the still film strip in the projector is always an animation of the inanimate. And we could think about the way in which the inanimate is both, as it were, something that doesn't move, the film still, that then becomes the illusion, so causing these kind of confusions, which is the film illusion, but also the way that any film animates the past, brings back into life its inhabitants on the screen who are actually long dead. So that the film is, I think as somebody said, film as time passes ceases to be a sphere so much of entertainment and becomes more a mausoleum, as it consists of this huge collection of filmed people, whether they're the smallest most irrelevant extra or the biggest star both go through that process of reanimation after death.
Incredible.
That's the kind of thing.
That's the kind of thing. Yes, that's the kind of thing I was thinking
couldn't
about.
say anymore.
But also, I think just so much about the we have a very much alive Carrie Schneider with us here, but then of course the Carries and the Romy Schneider up there made live, but no longer in that state, definitely.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting play on the work. But maybe with that said, I'm sure there are questions that there's a lot to say.
There's a roving microphone. Does anyone? Oh, we've got any
There's
questions from the audience? Oh, there's one over here.
Hi. Hi. Thanks everybody so much. This has been incredibly illuminating, and I really appreciate the commentary on technology and mechanism. Something that really struck me during your presentation, Carrie, was we got to see Sphinx in a dark room, all of us sitting shoulder to shoulder, and it really closely approximated the cinema-going experience. However, I think it's kind of a different flavor in the gallery when instead of a passive viewer, you have this active role as a viewer walking into the gallery space and having the option to turn your head, look around. Could you speak a little bit more to the intentionality of showing this in a gallery space and having that more active role as a spectator?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, did everyone hear the question? My decision to install the 16 millimeter film Sphinx in the gallery, and it's located in the gallery adjacent to two other photo sculptures, including Joël Van Dyne, Madame Psychosis Joël Van Dyne, which is the source material. I had wanted it to be displayed alongside that sculpture specifically, because I, just like Laura has been talking about as well, I feel like the moving image suggests the film strip, and I love that the sculpture was analogous to the film strip that's literally looping in the machine. And so I felt like having them side by side, maybe it's a little bit didactic, but I couldn't help myself. I like that, and you can kind of enter into the gallery, the first gallery, and it feels like there are three works in the room, whereas there's actually only the two. The Sphinx film has its own space, but you can hear the whirring of the mechanism, that it already kind of takes up some space in that way as well. So it was intentional. I'm curious if the effect is translates, but that was exactly what I had wanted. Also to, just the paradox of showing something that was on this small screen in the palm of my hand that then is kind of reanimated at the cinematic scale. I think that inversion was important as well. Thank you. Any other questions or follow-up? Got one in the front row and one in the back.
Thanks. I was just struck in the film with Romy Schneider how it's the moment that she says no photos, that you then photograph over and over, like in the micro detail. And I guess I was just wondering how you relate or don't relate to that photographer and like the position of photography, photographing her in this particular moment.
Oh yeah, I think it's something I've thought about a lot. So Laura, I don't know if you heard the question is how do
I did.
Okay, yeah.
I can hear.
There's this. She's extraordinarily vulnerable at this moment, and she's. What's made her vulnerable is the fact that she's being photographed by this male interloper who isn't supposed to be there, and it kind of takes her out of the otherwise chaotic scene. But I think for me, it kind of goes with the politics of reclaiming that there is this kind of taking back her image and maybe maybe potentially, I don't know if it's doing it justice or something, but kind of just like giving it a little bit of maybe some, I think the fact that my, how do I say this? That it's important to me, to the understanding of my work, that I'm identify as a woman, that there's that I am kind of working in this history of feminism, that is something that is kind of like thinking about representation and the ethics of representing a woman, that it's just something I've kind of thought about in my work for over a decade. So I think it's something that is constantly a question for me, and I think that is like this really ripe moment that it just struck me. At first I thought it was funny, that she's being photographed, but then I think there's something more to it that I think points in a lot of different directions that I think Laura has spoken to, and you have also. But I think I'm still kind of trying to locate some of those things for myself, but maybe it's more of a process of asking.
I'm going to quote you. At one point you said, I think in relationship to a different body of work, but that your work is both homage and theft. And I think there's something about that scene too, where it's like her resistance to being photographed is because that's a kind of, her image is being captured and owned, and that's what she doesn't want. She doesn't want to be. So I think in a way what you're kind of very much playing, and obviously the way that and you sourced that video from YouTube, the way that ownership and technologies have shifted. But I also thought you had just going back to that original film, Laura, in one of our first conversations, you said that you were kind of theorizing that the reason why the film director is a woman is because the photography had to be a man. So do you want to say, Laura, because I thought that was a good point.
Oh, I just said it in passing that if the director of the film had been a man, there would have been some kind of competition around the male gaze, whereas to have the director as a woman kind of, in a sense, denigrates her a bit. And the photographer's gaze can dominate. Also the way he's shot himself. Yeah. But I just wanted, just to say to that, I do think that the process of appropriating an image and also involves interpreting it. And so as well as the question of confusing time and juxtaposing different eras of time, it also relocates the image into a different context and into a different ideological discourse. So I would, from that point of view, say that Carrie was rephotographing Romy, was in a sense putting her within, as I said earlier, this kind of history of the movie star, the female movie star, and that the dilemma that always went with that highly valued but very often denigrated position.
Okay, I guess there's
Is
time
there
for
one more question? There's one in the back.
Thank you all so much. And all three of you spoke so eloquently about this art and the political primal scene, which seems so urgent right now to me. And about this exhibit, I did want to say what the first question, I had this instant experience with this exhibit, which is a lot of times when I see art, I take pictures, whatever, and someone will have missed the show and I show them. This exhibit of your work and all of this was so different than seeing, and I've seen some installations of this, like online, right? it's so different and real, and I guess that's a credit to all the people on this team here putting it together, that I felt like, so the moving images and the movement of the paper and the sculpture, the way the light bends on it, everything, it felt like I was moving. And I wondered so much about you as a maker, like, oh, does the positive and negative, does that find a different place in you? All these aspects, it was very alive, very different than most photography exhibits or sculptural exhibits. And then this discussion and the showing of the films just added to that. So I could have a bunch of questions, but I guess the one I want, although I'm very interested in appropriation, I think the image of Romy Schneider, which is, there's a lot of people who aren't going to know that film ever. They're going to see your work, and it's such a cool image, right? And I think that's valuable and good. It's like sampling a song. And do you think it's valuable? I guess I wonder if, like, people don't know the origination of that, and also that the male photographer looks at her kind of lovingly, the female director is mean to her and cruel, which is something people do to divide women. But all these questions which come up in this moment, and you all spoke, particularly Laura, a little bit about that, after Roe was killed, do you see this as urgent, those of you who, some of you won't know, as 1975? I do, you know, and it seems very new. And that the job of all of us, as whether we're artists or just take art to stay alive, do you see this as a maker of this kind of work, which is actually extremely political and alive, that it's more urgent than ever?
I mean, thank you so much for that question. I feel like I need to quote a friend of mine who has said that as a writer, writing has saved her life many times. And I feel like the urgency of art, I mean, I think of so many things. I have a lot of things that I could say in response. I think thinking of the radical imagination as something that could kind of help us find something that has never existed in the world before, be it prison abolitionism, or I think I'm thinking of like Marcuse and Angela Davis. I feel like that for me, just that all of these ideas are really linked. So I think that's what you're talking about, like how as we who are artists, thinking politically, in what ways does this actually feel urgent, and how does making work help, if it does? I don't know if that's what you're asking, and I think that those are big questions that I have as well. The thinking, I don't know if I have a great answer. You're nodding. Maybe I can pass it over to you or to Laura. Maybe Laura, is there anything you would want to say in response to this?
It's really a question and a statement about now and the urgency of now, which I 100% agree with. But to a certain extent, I feel that now that I'm 82, it's no longer so much up to, I've kind of handed it over to the younger generation to struggle with. And I suppose I feel that there are a lot of ways in which new technologies can be aesthetically and politically in dialogue with, can bring the past and the present together, and that's one of the things that I'm mainly interested in now. But I also feel that has a political implication, because in a sense, it's very difficult in such a hurried time to think about time and to understand temporalities, and that's one of the things that perhaps art can contribute to us. And I feel very strongly, as I tried to say in my paper, Carrie, that your exhibition certainly does bring those issues very much to the fore.
I think that's a beautiful way to end the night, if everyone agrees. And it's very late for Laura, so thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for the questions.